Good morning and welcome back. This is World Talks coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Jastrzębska. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy recently awarded the honorary title Heroes of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army to a unit within Ukraine's Special Operations Forces. The move has sparked a backlash in Poland. Here, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army is associated with the massacres of Polish civilians in Volhynia and eastern Galicia during the Second World War. Polish historians estimate that up to 100,000 people were killed between 1943 and 1945. Now, Polish President Karol Nawrocki has indicated he wants to strip Zelenskyy of the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest state honor, while other leading politician figures have also condemned the decision. So, what does this latest dispute tell us about the state of Polish-Ukrainian relations, and could it have longer-term consequences for cooperation between the two countries? To discuss this, I'm joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies, University College Dublin. Good morning, Professor. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So the move is seen as widely unpopular here in Poland. However, sources report that it is supported domestically. So is Volodymyr Zelenskyy prioritizing internal support, and why is he doing this?
Well, I think not only this episode, but you might remember that the honoring of the Ukrainian national leader, Melnyk, just a week ago with his reburial inside Ukraine. Again, a nationalist leader who was linked with Germany during World War II. From a Ukrainian perspective, many Ukrainians can see this as honoring nationalist forces who tried to resist the Soviet Union for decades after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, and then all the way through World War II. But of course, from a Polish perspective, rather than an internal Ukrainian perspective, these are units and leaders who were linked with the Germans in some of the worst historic massacres inside Poland that you have described. Just speaking as an analyst, I can assess the reasons why at this point, where Ukraine is turning the tide against the Russians, but still faces these daily missile and drone strikes, faces the Trump administration walking away from Ukrainian defense. I can see why Zelenskyy is rallying people with these steps. But as an analyst, I also think this is insensitive to an ally. It's insensitive to Poland, and it's insensitive to Polish people, given this history.
So how come there's such divergent views on the Ukrainian Insurgent Army? Where is the historical clarity on this issue?
Well, the point about the Ukrainian Insurgent Army is it depends on how your starting point for how you read that army. Now, if you read that army in the way that you quite rightly described, that, it is fighting alongside the Germans, then you are looking at a Ukraine army which you would see not just as an oppressor, but as a mass killer. But if you look at the Ukrainian Insurgent Army as an army that was fighting against the Soviets, who effectively had subjugated your country in the early 1920s, had denied you independence, continued to deny you independence, had killed millions of your people in the early 1930s in the Holodomor, then you read that in a different way. In no way, I have to emphasize, am I justifying any of the actions that were taken during World War II and mass killing. But the way that people approach this will depend on their perspective as whether you see this nationalist army as defending Ukrainian nationalism first, or whether you see it first being allied with Nazi Germany as Poles suffered from that German mass killing for years throughout the war.
Poland's President Karol Nawrocki hinted at the fact that Ukraine may not be ready to join the European family. Could this move and the fact that it has soured Polish-Ukrainian relations, at least for now, have consequences for Ukraine's EU bid?
We've seen this, by the way, throughout Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that there have been other episodes of friction between Poland and Ukraine over the World War II history. You might think about the issue of reburial of Polish victims that have taken place. You might think about the argument that Kyiv still has not recognized some of the mass killings. In this particular instance, however, I think, from a Polish internal perspective, you have a president and President Nawrocki who is not as supportive of the Ukraine resistance of Russia to the same degree that the government has been. This goes all the way back to the election, both of the government and then later of the president. And so without going too far here, I think there's a little bit of politics that's being played. There's politics being played inside Ukraine by deciding to do this, and then there's politics which is being played inside Poland. I don't think the government will go as far as the president to say, look, this risks Ukraine-Polish relations, although the government has said that they also believe this is insensitive, that this is not warranted. And I don't believe the government will see this as a roadblock to Ukraine's accession to the EU.
Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski said that the only one who benefits from a Ukraine-Poland spat over the past is Vladimir Putin. So shouldn't Zelensky keep that in mind?
Yeah, I think this was a move. And again, I've explained to you the domestic front and the domestic calculations, but I think this was a move which was not well thought out by Zelensky. And I have to say that I think Zelensky has generally, throughout the course of this, 51-month Russian invasion, has been very good at recognizing foreign perspectives here. He's gone from country to country and invoked their history of resistance against oppression, against mass killing. In this case, I think he has set that history aside. That said, look at the foreign minister's statement, and it goes back to what I just said, and that is the government is saying, I think quite rightly, that Russia benefits from any breakdown in Ukraine-Polish ties. And I think the government, therefore, is saying, look, as insensitive, as offensive, in fact, as this may be to Poles, as this is to Poles, that this should not be a cause for Poland to step away from support of Ukraine against the invasion.
Now, if we could segue to the latest developments on the US-EU front, the United States reportedly plans to cut its deep strike capabilities allocated to Europe by half. So how significant is this from a military and deterrence perspective?
Well, I think we have the latest statements that have been made by the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in Singapore. Hegseth is there just to simply provide rhetoric. But I think the rhetoric about an American shift to Asia is not new. I think it goes all the way back through this century. But this pivot to Asia takes on a special significance because of Russia's invasion of Europe. It should be possible for a responsible American administration to both say we need security in Asia and we need security in Europe. But this is not an administration which I think is responsible, and it's not an administration that thinks that European security is important. And this is not just a question of Pete Hegseth. It's a question of the president, Donald Trump, who has repeatedly belittled Europe, has repeatedly dismissed the notion that there's an alliance between the U.S. and Europe. And it's the argument that the vice president, J.D. Vance, made going all the way back to February 2025 at the Munich Security Conference, when he says, look, Europeans should be responsible for their own security. In effect, what has this got to do with us? Trying to set aside more than 80 years of history. So I'm going to treat it at this point as more white noise from the Trump administration. The reality here is that by and large, that administration has already left the building, as it were, in terms of Ukrainian security. It no longer provides aid to Ukraine. It is cutting back the sales of military equipment to NATO members for Ukraine because it's tied down in the failing war in Iran. And it no longer provides political support for Ukraine, including in the talks with Russia. We get back to the bottom line, which is that Europe and other countries around the world, the international community, they have to be self-sufficient in supporting Ukraine, because you cannot count on the Trump administration, even if American agencies, the military, the intelligence, the financial agencies do continue to work with Europe, both for European security and for the security of Kyiv.
Right, but still Washington is now asking European allies to explain how they intend to fill this capability gap. So is Europe realistically in a position to replace these assets, or does this expose just how dependent European security still is on the U.S.?
Look, from the standpoint of Donald Trump's inner circle, I don't care about what the Americans are asking for about Europe filling the capability gap, because they're just playing politics here. They've played politics all along, going back to Trump's first term. I care about the fundamental here, which is, look, there is an issue that Europe did not devote enough expenditure and thought to its defense. This goes back to 2014 with the pledge to spend 2% of GDP on defense, but was an ongoing issue of getting there. But many countries have gotten beyond 2%. Poland is now close to 5% of GDP being spent on defense. Several other countries are also moving towards that figure. What you now have to see is not only the expenditure from individual countries, but from the European Union, which is seeking 800 billion euros of investment in defense production over the next 5 years, to do that in a very effective way. From the standpoint of Ukraine, for example, you look at the joint production deals, which take place over drones, which take place over munitions, which takes place over air defenses. From the standpoint of European security, you have to look at, again, both at the level of individual countries and through NATO, those countries working together, because this is not just a Russian threat to Ukraine. This is a potential threat, not just with military operations, but with what we call hybrid operations, cyber operations, propaganda and disinformation, economic sabotage. This is a lasting threat. And Europe, I think, is recognizing that. I think European leaders are saying we need to have these capabilities. Now it's time to put that into action.
So, Professor, just to sum up, taken together with troop reductions, growing transatlantic tensions, Trump's repeated calls for Europe to shoulder more of the defense burden, are we witnessing a temporary rebalancing within NATO or a more fundamental shift in the alliance's future?
At this point, Trump and his inner circle do not believe in alliance. So there is no U.S. alliance with Europe for the first time since the aftermath of World War II. From the standpoint of American agencies, they continue to try to work with Europe, including through NATO. Remember that in recent days, we've had American officials talking to Ukraine about drone technology and production because the Americans are falling behind in that area and Ukraine is moving ahead because of the Russian invasion. We, of course, are having NATO talking about not just simply drone defenses, but wider defenses, and those talks include American officials. The question will be, on the day that Donald Trump leaves office, if he is not succeeded by a J.D. Vance, will we finally see a more responsible American government that will restore alliance at the highest level? And will those institutional ties have survived the damage that Trump has tried to wield upon them?
Professor Scott Lucas, University College Dublin, thank you so very much for joining us this morning. Much appreciated.
Thank you and your viewers.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.